In the year of our Lord, 1090, the shadow of the Seljuk Empire stretched across the known world like an endless night. From the golden domes of Isfahan to the dusty roads of Baghdad, the iron fist of Sultan Malik Shah and his Grand Vizier Nizam al-Mulk held the lands in a suffocating grip. But in the heart of the Alborz Mountains, where the air is thin and the rocks are sharp as daggers, a storm was brewing. Not of armies, not of thundering hooves, but of a single idea carried by a single man. Hasan Sabbah, a scholar, a mystic, a fugitive. He did not seek to confront the crushing might of the Seljuk army on the open field. He knew that to kill a giant, one does not strike at the armor, but at the heart. And his heart was set on a fortress that touched the clouds, Alamut, the eagle's nest. Legend says that an ancient Dalamite king once released his eagle, and the bird landed on this very rock. Seeing the strategic perfection of the peak, the king built a fortress there, calling it al-Mulk, the eagle's teaching. For centuries, it stood impenetrable, mocking those who tried to scale its vertical walls. It was controlled by a Seljuk governor, a man named Mahdi, who believed himself safe behind stone and void. He was wrong. Hasan did not come with catapults. He did not come with legions. He came as a ghost. Disguised as a simple teacher, a wandering ascetic, he slipped into the valley of Rudbar. The year was late autumn. The winds were turning cold, stripping the trees of their leaves just as Hasan intended to strip the Seljuks of their power. He walked the steep, winding paths, his eyes fixed on the fortress looming 2,000 meters above. He infiltrated the castle not by breaking the gates, but by opening the minds of those who guarded them. Day by day, night by night, he spoke to the garrison. He spoke of corruption, of divine justice, of a new order. Like water seeping into cracks in the stone, his words penetrated the hearts of the soldiers. The garrison, tired of the distant sultan's neglect, began to see this teacher not as a stranger, but as a savior. The governor, Mahdi, sat on his throne, blind to the revolution growing beneath his feet. He saw his soldiers praying. He saw them whispering, but he did not see the loyalty shifting like sand in an hourglass. By the time he realized who his guest truly was, it was already too late. The fortress was no longer his. On a cold morning, Hasan finally revealed himself. He did not draw a sword. He simply looked at Mahdi and told him that his time was over. The governor looked to his guards for support, but they stood silent, their eyes fixed on Hasan. The master of the castle was now a prisoner in his own home, defeated without a single drop of blood being spilt. Hasan, bound by his own code of honor, did not kill the deposed governor. He drafted a draft for 3,000 gold dinars, the price of the fortress, and handed it to the defeated man. Mahdi descended the mountain, leaving behind the rock that would soon become the center of a shadow empire. As the sun set over the jagged peaks of the Alborz, Hasan Sabbah stood on the highest tower of Alamut. He looked down at the world that wanted him dead. The eagle's nest was his. The order had found its home, and the world would soon learn to fear the silence of the mountain.
With the fortress secured, Hasan turned his gaze inward. He knew that stone walls could crumble and steel could rust, but a belief burned into the soul is indestructible. He needed more than soldiers. He needed instruments of pure will. Men who would not fear death, but embrace it as a lover. And to create such men, he had to offer them something the world could not. Paradise. Behind the cold, jagged walls of Alamut, in a valley hidden from the sun's harsh glare, a transformation began. The historians speak of a garden, a place constructed with precise intent. Canals filled with milk and honey, pavilions draped in silk, flowers that bloomed with scents unknown to the barren mountains outside. It was a theater of the senses, designed for one purpose: to mimic the promised afterlife. Young men were brought to the fortress, chosen for their strength, but also for their emptiness. They were given a potion, a heavy, sweet drink that clouded the mind and loosened the grip of reality. They fell into a deep sleep in the cold stone cells of the castle. But when they opened their eyes, the stone was gone. They awoke in the garden. The air was warm and smelled of jasmine. The sound of wind was replaced by the gentle trickling of water. Beautiful figures moved through the trees, offering them fruits and wine, whispering that they had died and crossed over. For 3 days and 3 nights, these young men lived in a dream. They tasted perfection. They believed with every fiber of their being that they were in heaven. Then, just as suddenly, the dream ended. They were drugged again, dragged back into the cold, harsh reality of the fortress. They awoke on the hard stone floors, the taste of honey replaced by the taste of dust. The despair was absolute. They had seen paradise, and they had been cast out. It was then that Hasan would appear before them, not as a jailer, but as the gatekeeper. He told them that they had not dreamt. They had been allowed a glimpse of what awaited them if they served. Their lives on earth were now meaningless, mere waiting rooms for their return to the garden. The fear of death vanished instantly. Why fear death when death was the key to the garden? Hasan had forged the ultimate weapon, the Fidai. One day, to demonstrate this absolute control to a visiting enemy general, Hasan nodded to a guard standing on the highest rampart. Without a word, without hesitation, the man stepped off the edge into the void. He fell with a smile on his face. The general left in terror. Hasan sat in silence. The eagle's nest was no longer just a fortress, it was a factory of ghosts. The factory of ghosts had begun its work. The young men, drunk on the memory of the garden and fearless of death, waited in the shadows of Alamut. They were no longer mere soldiers. They were living daggers held tight in the hand of the old man of the mountain. And now Hasan Sabbah was ready to strike. He did not point his weapon at a fortress or an army. He pointed it at the very heart of the empire. The year was 1092. The Seljuk Empire stretched from the borders of China to the Mediterranean Sea. It was a titan of steel and faith. But the mind behind this titan was not the Sultan. It was his Grand Vizier, Nizam al-Mulk. He was the architect of the laws, the builder of the schools, and the sworn enemy of Alamut. He had vowed that the coming winter would be the end of Hasan and his heretics. Nizam al-Mulk gathered his generals. He prepared a massive army to crush the eagle's nest into dust. He believed that stone walls could be broken by catapults. He believed that power was measured in thousands of horses and spears. He was mistaken. Hasan did not send an army to meet him on the battlefield. He sent a single shadow, a boy from the garden. The vizier was traveling from Isfahan to Baghdad. His caravan was like a moving city. It stretched for miles across the dusty plains, a river of wealth, silk, and armor. Thousands of elite guards rode on the flanks, creating a wall of flesh and iron designed to keep death away. Nizam al-Mulk sat in his litter, believing he was untouchable. But death does not always come with the roar of battle. Sometimes it walks in rags. Trailing behind the glorious caravan was a ragged group of beggars and dervishes swallowing the dust of the horses. Among them walked the assassin. He wore the coarse wool cloak of a Sufi mystic. He kept his head down, his eyes fixed on the ground, his mind replaying the promise of paradise. Day after day he walked. He endured the heat, the thirst, and the scorn of the soldiers. He carried no shield, only a single dagger hidden deep within his rough clothes. He was invisible to them because they looked for a warrior, not a beggar. The sun began to set near the village of Sana. The sky turned a deep, bruised purple. The caravan halted for the evening prayer. The noise of the march died down. Tents were pitched, fires were lit. The vizier stepped out of his litter to break his fast. The wall of guards parted for a brief moment to let the petitioners approach. It was the crack in the armor. The dervish stepped forward. He did not run. He did not scream. He moved with the silence of a ghost returning to the grave. To the guards, he was just a shadow in the twilight. By the time they saw the glint of steel, it was too late. The strike was precise, fatal. The boy from the garden did not try to escape. He accepted the swords that cut him down moments later as a final embrace, a ticket back to the paradise he had been promised. But he had traded his life for the head of a king. Nizam al-Mulk lay on the Persian soil. His grand plans and mighty armies instantly rendered meaningless. The news traveled faster than the wind. Panic swept through the palaces of Isfahan. If the Grand Vizier, protected by thousands, could be struck down in his own camp, then who was safe? The invincible armor of the state had been pierced by a single needle. Far away, in the high tower of Alamut, Hasan Sabbah sat in his chamber. A messenger bird had arrived. He read the scroll calmly. He picked up his quill. On a piece of parchment, where a list of names was written, he found the first one, Nizam al-Mulk. With a steady hand, he drew a line through it. The first ghost had returned home, but the list was still very long.
With the Grand Vizier dead, The heavy mantle of the empire fell solely upon the shoulders of Sultan Malik Shah. His grief quickly turned into a cold, burning rage. He looked at the mountain peaks in the distance and swore an oath. He declared that he would not rest until every stone of Alamut was pulled down and the nest of the eagles was cast into the abyss. The Sultan mobilized the full might of the Seljuk war machine. Regiments of cavalry, siege engineers, and thousands of foot soldiers marched towards the Rudbar Valley. The ground shook beneath their feet. It was a force capable of crushing kingdoms, let alone a single fortress perched on a rock. Malik Shah was the ruler of the world, from the borders of China to the gates of Byzantium. He believed himself to be invincible. The army set up camp at the foothills of the Alborz Mountains. It was a city of canvas and fire. At the center of this sprawling camp stood the royal tent. It was a palace of silk and velvet, surrounded by 3 rings of elite guards. These men were the finest warriors in the empire, sworn to die for their master. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their spears creating a forest of steel. No man, no beast, no shadow could pass through them unseen. The night was moonless and heavy with fog. The fires of the camp flickered and died down. The silence of the mountains descended upon the valley. Inside his tent, the Sultan retired for the night. The air was thick with the scent of incense and the warmth of braziers. He lay down on his silken pillows, surrounded by the illusion of absolute safety. He closed his eyes, his mind filled with plans of the destruction he would unleash come morning. The night passed. The guards outside remained vigilant, their eyes peeling the darkness. But inside the tent, something impossible was happening. A presence had entered. Not by force, but by silence. A figure stood over the sleeping emperor of the world. He watched the Sultan breathe. He held the power of life and death in his hand, but he did not strike. Instead, he knelt down beside the royal bed. Malik Shah awoke before the dawn. The camp was still quiet. He stretched his limbs, turning to rise from his bed. And then he froze. His heart hammered against his ribs. The blood drained from his face. There, driven deep into the hard earth floor, mere inches from his head, was a dagger. It was not a ceremonial weapon, it was a killing tool. Its handle was cold, its blade buried in the ground like a tombstone. Pinned beneath the sharp steel was a small rolled piece of parchment. The Sultan sat there, paralyzed. He looked at the entrance of the tent. It was still sealed. He listened for the guards. They were still at their posts, yet death had been in the room with him. With trembling hands, he pulled the dagger from the earth and unfurled the note. The words were written in elegant script,
the voice of the old man of the mountain echoing in the Sultan's mind. O Sultan, do not be deceived by your armies or your guards. I have agents in your court, in your kitchen, and in your very tent. If I had wished, this dagger which I placed in the hard ground could have been placed in your soft heart. Make peace with us, or your next sleep will be your last. Malik Shah lowered the paper. The realization washed over him like icy water. He was fighting a war he could not win. He could defeat an army on the open field, but he could not fight the air itself. He could not fight a shadow that could walk through walls and stand by his bedside. By noon, the orders were given. The siege engines were dismantled, the tents were struck, the massive army turned its back on the mountain and began the long march home. The Sultan of the world had bowed to the master of the mountain. Without a single battle, the war was over. Hasan Sabbah had proved that the fear of death is far more powerful than death itself.
The storms of war had finally settled. The great empires that once surrounded the mountain like wolves had retreated into the dust of history. The sultans who swore to destroy the fortress were dead and buried. But the fortress remained, and inside it, the heart of the shadow still beat. Hasan Sabbah, the man who made kings tremble in their iron towers, was now an old man. His beard was white as the snow on the Alborz peaks. His skin was like parchment, written over by the trials of a lifetime. For the last 35 years of his life, he did not leave the castle of Alamut. He did not step foot outside the gates. In fact, historians say he barely left his own chambers. He conquered the world not with a sword, but from a small, dimly lit room with a pen in his hand. While the world below feared the assassin's blade, inside the high walls, Hasan built a different legacy. He was not just a warrior, he was a scholar of the highest order. He filled his shelves with books on astronomy, mathematics, alchemy, and theology. He spent his nights charting the stars that wheeled above the eagle's nest, and his days writing treatises that would baffle the wise men of Baghdad. He taught his followers that the discipline of the mind was sharper and far more deadly than any dagger. The silence of his room was heavier than the roar of any battlefield. Seasons changed outside his narrow window. He watched the winters turn the mountains white and the springs bring the wildflowers to the valleys. He saw the futility of gold and the impermanence of power. He lived as a ghost in his own castle. He ate little, he spoke less. He lived as an ascetic, stripping away the desires of the flesh until only the pure, hard will remained.
His eyes were always fixed on a horizon that only he could see, a vision of a new world order. His sons died, his friends passed away, the world transformed, but the old man of the mountain remained, a constant, unmoving point in a turning universe. He became a myth while he was still breathing. In the year 1124, the end finally came. The body that had endured deserts and sieges finally gave way. He fell ill, but he did not fear death. He had used death as a tool for too long to be afraid of the handle. He called his deputies to his bedside. The room was dark, lit only by the dying embers of a fire. He gave his final orders. He appointed his successor. He ensured that the order would not die with him. He spoke calmly, as if he were merely planning a journey to the next village, not to the next world. On a quiet evening in May, surrounded by his books and the cold stone walls that had been his only true companions, Hasan Sabbah closed his eyes. The breath left his body. The heart that had stopped the heart of an empire beat one last time, and then silence. Years later, the Mongols would come. Hulagu Khan would bring a storm of fire to the mountains. They would burn Alamut to the ground. They would smash the walls and burn the great library. They thought they could erase him from history. They thought that by burning the paper, they could kill the ghost. They were wrong. The stones may crumble. The ink may fade into ash, but the legend of the eagle's nest remains. It seeped into the soil, into the water, into the very air of the mountains. As long as there are shadows in the peaks, the story of Hasan Sabbah will be whispered in the wind. The eagle has flown.